Tonight on KQED Newsroom, Democratic House managers make their case against President Trump as the Senate impeachment trial moves forward. Also, new revelations implicate the Saudi crown prince in the hacking of Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos' phone. And the Noir City Film Festival starts tonight in San Francisco, regarded by some as the birthplace of the genre. Good evening and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Lily Jamali. We begin tonight with the latest on the impeachment trial of President Trump. Today marks the third and final day for House Democrats to present their opening arguments to the Senate to press their case that the president should be removed from office for abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Lead House impeachment manager Adam Schiff began by calling on senators to decide, quote, what kind of democracy you believe we ought to be. Schiff also argued that rejecting witnesses would further add to the obstruction charges. Trump's legal team is set to begin Saturday morning. The defense has up to 24 hours spread over 3 days to make their case, the same rules that apply to House managers. With me now is KQED politics and government correspondent Marisa Lagos and GOP strategist Sean Walsh. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Sean, let's start with you. Main takeaways from this week so far?
Nothing's changed. The polls haven't changed. Actually, if anything, the polls have slipped a little bit with regards to people's views on this issue. The Democrats haven't made the case to change any of the general public's views. Mitch McConnell's holding fast on the rule changes, and absent John Bolton showing up with a bombshell, I think this thing's over in a week and a half.
Marisa, what do you think? How is the public taking all of this in? Is there fatigue?
Yeah, I think there is fatigue, and I think that your average person doesn't have 6, 8, 10 hours a day to sit and watch, C-SPAN, which even those of us whose job it is don't have the time. I disagree with Sean in the sense that I do think that the polls, it's very early still. There's been a few polls this week, but I think it'll give us we need a little more time to see how people are reacting. I do think we have seen public opinion shift slightly towards Democrats' way in recent months, but I agree that if you have been paying attention since this story really broke in September, October, the facts of what Democrats have presented have not changed this week. Now, Republicans also don't want those facts to change. They've been blocking new witnesses. They do not want an expansion of evidence. So I do think it's a little disingenuous to say, well, nothing's changed when you are trying to keep it from changing.
Is there any circumstance under which the Senate votes to remove this president, Sean?
None. I even think it would take Mr. Bolton or someone to come up with an absolute bombshell showing a picture of, Putin and Donald Trump in a steam bath together talking about, taking over the election.
That would even do it, honestly.
Yeah, that's a stretch
we're talking, what, 20 Republicans would have to switch sides?
And let me tell you why it won't happen. It won't happen because elections are decided by a razor-thin margin. 25 Republicans are up in this election cycle, and the Trumpistas are absolutely rabid. So if you're perceived not to be loyal to Donald Trump, then a number of them won't show up and you will lose. And there will not be enough moderate Democrats to come over and make up that loss. So they're all about self-preservation. They want this thing to be done and gone as soon as possible.
I do think one interesting question is this potential vote on witnesses and whether Democrats actually want Republicans like Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, who they do see as weak in 2020, to take that vote, right? There's this question from a handful of moderates. Do we cross over? They only need, 3 or 4? And if they get them, Democrats get them, then they might be able to compel some witnesses like John Bolton. But in a way, from a political perspective, Democrats who are out organizing right now in the field may actually prefer that the Republicans take the vote on the Republican side because then they can't use it in their reelection campaign to say, see, I let the evidence come forward, but then I voted to acquit Donald Trump.
Well, since you've both brought up John Bolton, former national security advisor for this president, his story is going to come out, whether it's in a book or whether it comes out in time for people to hear it during these proceedings. Do you see any scenario in which Mitch McConnell decides, yeah, okay, we might want to bring him in, or is there just an absolute no way
whatsoever from Mitch McConnell's perspective? And if you're John Bolton, he's writing a book. He doesn't want to give up all the goodies in a testimony where he can cost himself millions of dollars. And he also does not want to be the John Dean of this Republican administration where Republicans and conservatives turn against him because they're thinking about the Supreme Court. They're thinking about regulations that are getting rolled back. They're thinking about all the things that are happening subsurface. And John Bolton does not want to be the guy that is perceived as being the traitorous Republican.
So as a Republican, you know, we've heard all these stories about senators falling asleep, chewing gum, trying to, you know, take breaks. How have you viewed your party this week in terms of the way that Senate Republicans have comported themselves during this process?
I think the Senate Republicans have done fine. Actually, I think the Democrats made a big mistake. Jerry Nadler, the Democrat, who's one of the House managers, came up and insulted them and said that basically they're part of this broad-based conspiracy. It almost felt like Hillary Clinton's vast right-wing conspiracy. And it really did turn off. This was not just a talking point, but it turned off Susan Collins and it turned off other moderate Republicans, and it made it easier for them actually to push back on Democrats about witnesses and changing the rules.
Mm-hmm. This is a California story in many respects. We have people like Adam Schiff really being the stars of this show, the congressman from Burbank, who is also the House Intelligence Committee chair. Let's actually hear from him during his speech on Thursday night. Here he is.
I think all of us in this room have grown up in a generation where each successive generation lived with more freedom than the one that came before. We each had more freedom of speech and association, freedom to practice our faith. This was true at home, it was true all over the world. And I think we came to believe this was some immutable law of nature, only to find it isn't. Only to come to the terrible realization that this year fewer people live in freedom than last, and there's no guarantee that next year people will live in more freedom than today. And the prospect for our children is even more in doubt.
You hear him there talking about this idea of preserving democracy for future generations. Marisa, how would you rate his performance?
I mean, I think he's been great. He's a former prosecutor. He's taken this task on in a sober manner. I think he has laid out a case. I mean, even Lindsey Graham at one point had something nice to say about the sort of tapestry that they had woven. What I'm interested to see is how the Trump lawyers respond. Because if you look at everything we've talked about so far today, it's not about the substance here. There actually has not been a debate among Republicans, or at least they're talking about it, or even what we saw in some of the earlier statements from the lawyers from the White House, to substantively defend Trump's actions, right? I mean, it's pretty clear cut what happened in that phone call. The transcript was released, what Fiona Hill and all the other witnesses said. So I think like it's going to be fascinating to see if it feels like a true sort of courtroom where we have the defense coming up and trying to answer a lot of these questions, or if it's just more and more process. And also if they take the full 24 hours.
Well, Trump's team is up tomorrow, which I couldn't help but notice is a Saturday.
Yeah, maybe they don't want anybody to be watching this. I mean, I do think that that's part of it.
They don't. You've got a virus that's going on in China now that's now 20 states are looking at this virus. You've seen video of bodies literally piling up in Chinese hospitals. People are paying attention to other issues. They're not, as Marisa said, focused, riveted to their TV screens like it was during the Nixon impeachment. So if you're a Republican, you want this thing dead and gone. This is a problem for you. Cut your arm off, get it healed, and move on. You don't want this thing debated, discussed, and you don't want the finer points of Federalist Paper 15 discussed by the Republicans. You don't.
And we are expected to see what I've heard called counter-programming coming from the Trump administration next week. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to come to Washington. What exactly is going to be the deflection approach next week from the president?
Well, it sounds like a pretty controversial, let's say, from what we've heard around leaks about what they want to do with Israel and the settlements. I don't think that this is something that the Palestinians are going to embrace. I'm not sure that it's something that's going to go anywhere, but it will certainly make headlines, to Sean's point, and I think give the president an opportunity to talk about something else.
What does impeachment mean for the 2020 election? And I'm not just talking about the presidential election, but how the Senate might look coming out of 2020.
Well, I think it's an acid wash. I actually think that the reason the Democrats rushed this thing through as quickly as possible was for political calculus. Nancy Pelosi wants additional seats in her House. I'm not sure she wanted it originally, but there was too much pressure on the left for her not to do it. It's an acid wash on Republicans that are running for office as well. Again, if you're a Republican, in some respects, you're held hostage. You can't criticize the president and move because some of the activist people will come against you. And if you actually go out and promote Trump, you're going to get moderate Republicans doing so. The silence is golden. You don't have to explain what you don't say. And I think that's the mantra in this impeachment process for Republicans that are running in this next election cycle.
I would just say that, yes, if everything goes the way we expect it to at this exact moment and there are not witnesses and this is wrapped up quickly, we will be moving on to the Iowa caucuses, to the State of the Union, to the rest of the Democratic primary. And let's not forget how short a sort of attention span this country has. But again, if you look at the sort of overall polling, I do think that there has been, sort of some movement towards Democrats in recent months. I am not sure, to Sean's point earlier, that that's going to entirely change the calculus of the sort of electoral map, because so much of the presidential race, but also some of these Senate races and even congressional races are going to be about other issues as well.
What's the inside discussion within the California Republican Party on this right now?
I think it's turnout. I mean, the bottom line is that there was a wave, principally between, mostly with women and some moderate Republican women, that wiped out the Republicans. If they can pick up 1 or 2 congressional seats that they lost, then they'll call it a victory. The party's on the move back forward. And I mean, the goals or the bar is very, very low for the California Republican Party. But on the national stage, it's a whole different story. I mean, the Republicans really, really want to take back Congress. And they're thinking that if Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren are the nominees, then in a lot of these states that were swing states, they're going to be too radical and too much. And when we looked at Adam Schiff talking about freedom, they say freedom is not what the Democrats want. Mandated health care by the government and all the other prescriptive things that the federal government wants to do. So that's the Republican play.
All right. Well, thanks to both of you for making time for us this afternoon. KQED politics and government correspondent Marisa Lagos and GOP strategist Sean Walsh. Great to have you both.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Lily.
This week, Silicon Valley got a shock when officials close to the Saudi crown prince told the Wall Street Journal they had knowledge of a plan to hack the phone of Amazon founder and CEO Jeff Bezos. Bezos' phone was now famously hacked last year, leading to the self-revelation of an extramarital affair. Also this week, Google became the 4th company ever to reach $1 trillion in market value. And the latest battle for eyeballs in the streaming wars has begun, and Netflix is feeling the pressure. With me now is San Francisco bureau chief and tech editor for MarketWatch, Jeremy Owens, and business columnist for the LA Times, Michael Hiltzik, who joins us now via Skype from Los Angeles. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Good to be here.
And Michael, let's start with you in Los Angeles, because you're just out with a column this morning talking about how you're not convinced that Silicon Valley is going to suddenly start viewing Saudi Arabia as toxic to take investment from.
That's right. The big scandal that's connected to the Saudi regime is the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, who was a columnist for the Washington Post. He was a well-known Saudi critic and dissident. He was murdered. It's well established that he was murdered by the Saudi regime in 2018. And the point I made is that if that hasn't caused the Saudi regime to be toxic as an investor or as an investment destination, then this word that the regime may have hacked Jeff Bezos' phone isn't going to do it either.
And we're not just talking about Silicon Valley. You talk about Hollywood and other industry that is very entrenched in taking money from Saudi Arabia.
Right. A lot of industries, a lot of American companies see Saudi Arabia as a growing market opportunity. So we've seen hotel companies like Marriott signing deals. We've seen construction companies like Bechtel signing deals. We see high-tech companies showing a lot of interest in investing in the Saudi industrial infrastructure. So a lot of them are going in. You can look at this and say capital has no inherent morality or it's amoral, but individuals make these decisions about where to invest and who to take money from. And at this point, there's very, very little evidence that anybody is saying we should not be doing business with Saudi Arabia.
And not only who to take money from, but who to take direction from. Remember that the Saudis own a board seat on Uber, one of the biggest companies to go public last year, and a huge company in San Francisco. And it does span beyond tech. As you mentioned, McKesson here in San Francisco as well is one of the largest builders there is. And they have a lot of involvement with the Saudis, as you mentioned in your column.
That's true. And I mentioned also Penske Media, which owns Variety and Rolling Stone and Women's Wear Daily. They took $200 million from Saudi Arabia In 2018, the Saudi investment is still live over at Penske, and it looks like it's part of the kingdom's effort to really control the narrative about its behavior.
Yeah, and you mentioned also Endeavor, which, unlike the companies you just laid out there, did give the money back after the Khashoggi killing. Endeavor, the big talent agency down in Hollywood. Jeremy, what do we know at this point about the mechanics of how this hack was carried out?
Well, a lot of it comes from a consultancy, I believe it's called FTI, that examined Bezos's iPhone. And they weren't able to say exactly, with 100% confidence that this was the thing that did it, but there was a WhatsApp message from MBS to Bezos. And after he received that message, which they weren't even able to say whether he clicked on or not, all of a sudden he started sending a lot of data from his iPhone towards Saudi Arabia. So that's what kind of gave them the confidence to say, well, this is probably what did it. But, there have been doubts from other people who say they should be able to get more from this phone and from this message. Alex Stamos, from the former chief security officer of Facebook, which owns WhatsApp, actually told the Wall Street Journal this morning that he believes that if they had jailbreak the phone, if they had been able to get into more of that message in WhatsApp, they should be able to tell us more than they're telling us right now.
Quickly, would love your take on Michael's column. I mean, there's so much money from Saudi Arabia sloshing around in Silicon Valley, and there are late-stage companies still in startup mode that are desperate for capital.
They are, and one of the few places they've gotten capital over the last year or two has been SoftBank, and that SoftBank Vision Fund is almost half Saudi money, right? And right now we have a lot of startups desperate for cash, right? We're seeing austerity in a lot of these late-stage startups, and things like 23andMe and Postmates, a lot of delivery companies that are starting to lay people off and look for ways to look better for IPO. If they can find money to get them through and give them time to get to IPO and look a little bit better, they're going to take whatever money they can get at this point, because there just aren't a lot of people out there willing to give money to late-stage startups.
Jeremy, let's switch gears and talk about Alphabet reaching a $1 trillion market cap. So Amazon got there and has fallen back, but Microsoft is still there, as is Apple. What makes Google different?
Well, Google's different if you look at Apple and Microsoft. Now, Amazon never actually officially made it there. They made it there on a single trade intraday and fell back. They've never closed at that level. Google joins Apple and Microsoft, and if you just look at when they were founded, those are different generations of companies. Apple and Microsoft are that first generation of tech. Google is the second generation. So for it to make it there with lesser revenues, lesser finances than those, shows that the different parts within Alphabet, beyond just Google search, but you're talking about YouTube, you're talking about Waymo, a lot of these different businesses that Google owns, Android, are potentially very valuable. And I think that's what investors see. And so they're not as scared of antitrust. In fact, if you're looking at it from an investment perspective, if they did break up Alphabet and force some of these companies to be independent, they may be worth more. That's one of the most fun games Wall Street can play. How much is YouTube worth as an independent entity?
Yeah, so
nobody knows.
So in some respect, that lack of transparency over breaking out how much each of these units makes might be playing to Google's hand. Michael, what's your take on that? Do you think that investors have become complacent about the idea that the Antitrust Police might come along and break Alphabet and Google up?
I think investors are probably properly skeptical that something like that is really going to happen. First of all, of course, you need a Democratic president, and it would help also to have both chambers of Congress in Democratic hands as well. Even if that happens, breaking up a company on the scale is a complicated procedure. This effort would have to go before a judge, an appeals court, maybe the Supreme Court. And I think it's fair to say that even if a Democratic administration does try to break up Alphabet and any other big tech companies, as Elizabeth Warren and others have threatened, the ultimate breakup isn't going to resemble just a pure divestment that she's been talking about or anybody else has been talking about. There'll be compromises.
Well, Jeremy, I want to touch briefly on an area that you've been reporting a lot on these last couple of weeks, the streaming wars in 2020. Who do you think is going to be the big winner this year?
Well, it's more holding on, right, for Netflix, right? I think if Netflix can hold on to its huge, $100 billion plus valuation, it will have won. Because right now it is everybody coming for Netflix's throne. So if Netflix can just maintain this year, which I think it will, right? What we're seeing, and I think what we'll see even more, is consumers bouncing around between some of these streaming services. It's unlike a cable bundle where you have to have, a multi-year contract. You basically sign up for a month and you can bounce around, right? And I think we're going to see consumers doing that more and more. So if Netflix has to find a way to make sure that people stick around and don't leave it to sign up for Apple TV Plus and Disney Plus and some of these other services that are coming online now.
All right, Jeremy Owens from Market Watch with me here in San Francisco, and Michael Hiltzik of the LA Times via Skype. Thanks so much to both of you.
Thanks.
A former Nazi hunting serial killer, a social outcast framed for murder, a resistance fighter plotting assassination. These are just a few of the characters you'll find at San Francisco's annual Noir City Film Festival, which kicks off tonight at the Castro Theater. Founder Eddie Muller describes his favorite genre as suffering with style. This year, the suffering goes global. For the first time, the 10-day festival will feature all foreign-made films from Japan, Germany, Mexico, and more. No matter the language, the films explore what makes an average person do the wrong thing and what happens when they do. With me now is founder and president of the Film Noir Foundation, Eddie Muller. Welcome to you, Eddie.
It is a pleasure to be here, Lily. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. Well, why don't we begin by having you just describe to the not so artistically inclined what film noir is exactly?
Well, film noir was an artistic movement that largely happened in the mid-20th century, primarily in Hollywood, but as this festival attests, not exclusively in Hollywood. Mostly they're crime films, as you aptly put it. It's about people who know they're doing the wrong thing and then they do it anyway and pay the consequences. And I appreciate the suffering with style.
Hey, that
line.
was you.
But I guarantee that the audience doesn't suffer. They get to vicariously watch other people suffer on screen, but the films are hugely entertaining.
And this genre originated when Hollywood was used to putting happy endings on everything.
Yes. Well, that's why it has stood the test of time and why it stands out so much as a movement. I mean, in Hollywood, artists had always wanted to tell all kinds of stories, but then when the pictures began to talk in the early 1930s, then the Depression hit, and Hollywood was asked to do sort of its duty and make uplifting films to get people through the Depression. Then as soon as the Depression ended, we find ourselves entering a world war, and the same thing applies. It's like you can't tell gritty, truthful stories because you have to boost the public's morale. So one of the odd consequences of winning World War II is that artists finally got to be liberated to tell stories they'd always wanted to tell that don't necessarily have a happy ending. So film noir is sort of the anti-myth of Hollywood, where in Hollywood everything's supposed to end happily ever after. In film noir, not always the case.
So Eddie, you do these festivals all over the country and actually all over the world. How is San Francisco different from doing the festival in, say, Paris?
Well, I can't speak to Paris. I've done a film series in Paris that was hugely successful, and I will say that Paris is the most cinema-loving city in the world. But there is no question that San Francisco is the most sophisticated movie-going community in America. And none of the, I don't want to say this, I hope this doesn't get out to the rest of the country, but none of the other festivals compare to San Francisco. I mean, this city has allowed me to do what I do with the Film Noir Foundation, which is raise money to restore films that are lost, because the Castro Theater seats 1,400 people, and we fill it for this festival, and it's become kind of a cultural institution, I'm happy to say. This is our 18th year doing it.
And this year is a departure for you. You're used to doing all American films, but this year all the films are global. As the person who programs the festival, was it hard to find content?
Yes. This was a real challenge, this year's festival, but worth it, I think. This is the one that I'm most excited about of all the festivals that I've done. Just because I love the idea of turning an audience on to things they have not seen before. And because these all fit a certain pattern, they're all in this, if you want to call it a genre of film, there will be similarities that people will recognize between the American version of these stories and wherever it's coming from, Italy or Germany or Czechoslovakia or Argentina. They'll see the commonality as much as they'll see how it plays slightly different in another culture. Which is really the theme of the whole festival, and that's why I did it.
Yeah, so what can you tell us, having gone through this process over the last year, about how film noir globally is different from the more traditional thing, the American films that we're used to associating with film noir? Well,
you see the way a culture, things are different. For example, in American film noir, there are a lot of stories about men who are compromised by the femme fatale, the evil woman, right? When you see noir from Mexico, it's completely reversed. The women are the protagonists. They usually are nightclub entertainers who are like caught between the bad man and the upstanding man, and there's this life and death struggle with female protagonists. That's very, very common in Mexican cinema, not common at all in the United States during the same period. So that's a major difference. And it's also interesting because a lot of the films, like the ones we're showing from Germany, from Italy, and Japan, are all films from the immediate post-war era from countries that lost that war. And so that has a major impact on the stories that are told and sort of the tone of defeat and, dare I say, disgrace that they're trying to rise out of, I find very, very fascinating.
It sounds like a lot of the themes that you're thinking about in a historical context have relevance today.
I think people will be very, very surprised when they watch these quote-unquote old movies at how much relevance they have to current events.
Do you have a favorite film that's playing in this festival? It's a 10-day festival in the Castro, so a lot to choose from.
There are a great many. I, of course, love the films that my foundation restored, which are the two films showing tonight. I take great pride in that. There's a film from Japan that's playing next Thursday called Pale Flower that I absolutely love. So I'd say that one is a can't miss for me, but they're all good. People should see them all.
You can't go wrong. All right, well, founder and president of the Film Noir Foundation, Eddie Muller, it's so great to have you here. Good luck with the festival.
Thank you so much, Lily. I greatly appreciate it.
All right, well, the festival runs through February 2nd at the Castro Theater in San Francisco. To buy tickets and to learn more, visit noircity.com. That'll do it for us. As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/newsroom. I'm Lily Jamali. Thank you for joining us.